Tuesday, so it's time for the history of the world to begin. This course is one that I haven't taught before, and to the best of my knowledge, no one else at Columbia has taught it before, because world history has generally been regarded as a subject that either cannot or should be taught at elite universities. It has been a very unusual area of history in that instead of deriving from the thought and writings of famous historians, it has emerged from the ground up. From essentially, it's a demand side course that comes out of the K through 12 educational system.
So that's the great question in world history. If you're doing this massive survey, what do you leave out?
But in terms of how you go about setting it up, that is a question I don't think anyone has ever successfully answered, because I think it is one of the most challenging courses to teach, because there's so much material to cover, and it's one of those courses where you're constantly tinkering with it.
World history particularly is such a broad subject that it is kind of hard to determine what are the most important parts. And additionally, with globalization the way it is, teaching trends now, everything is so interdependent.
The point of view is really skewed from, I think, an everyday point of view, an everyday experience of history, because you're really trying to cover, at the minimum, maybe 5,000 years of history, which is an inconceivable amount. It's 10 times the amount of time you're supposed to cover or you're kind of expected to cover for the second part of the class, where you can kind of be a little more specific. I think that's one of the big problems, is trying to tell a meaningful story within such an impractical amount of material. There's no conceivable way that you can do the Roman Empire on its own in 2 or 3 or 4 classes. You just have to kind of figure out the most critical elements and connect them with your unifying theme. I usually start off my class by telling them that there is a kind of unfortunate amount of material that's left on the editor's floor.
So the big challenge every semester that I teach the class is figuring out, what do I leave out? Because it's almost like a joke talking to colleagues who teach 1111. So who did you leave out this semester? The Egyptians, the Hebrews, Native Americans? So somebody gets left out, and that's just the nature of the class.
I often have to leave out certain parts of the world, and I try to do that. I try to rotate. Like there may be one semester where I do a lot on Southeast Asia and India. Another semester I'd focus more on China and Japan. So it's hard to fit it all in. I really struggle with this question of the coverage, the breadth of the coverage versus the depth of our investigation of these topics, and to get all of these areas of the world covered and to get the period of time that we're covering, because that's the other challenge. We're covering from 1500 to the present in the world history course I teach. It's virtually impossible to do that unless you just move boom, 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 boom. Then when you do that, you leave a lot of students behind, and we're struggling with trying to engage our students more, get them more interested, and it's hard to be interested when you're moving at this race car-like pace. So
I think that's the biggest challenge, is just trying to make these very complicated topics intelligible without reducing them to something that you would teach an elementary school child or something.
Most world history courses tend to focus on Europe, and it kind of just this like there's a medieval period, and then they just kind of skip-ish to like, oh, they found America, and then it's like, here's how they related to America. And then they might mention, like, for a day, oh, the Middle East existed, and then somewhat of Asia for like a day. well, that's cool. The Chinese had a thing with silk and tea, and let's move on.
We have 2 world history courses, and all University of West Georgia students are required to take one of those classes. There's a common learning outcome that has been approved by the Board of Regents, and in essence, that the goal of the course then is stated in that learning outcome, that all students who complete the course successfully will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the political, social, economic, or cultural dimensions of world history.
One thing that we have to keep in mind is most students who take this class, they're not history majors. So the question is, what do we want them to know? And just thinking of humanities as what makes us human, what makes us better people. So it's going to sound really cliche, but I want my students to come out as better people from this class, knowing more about other civilizations, other religions, other perceptions, worldview. And that's something that's huge. In my view, that's the most important thing perhaps that I can convey to them, the idea that other civilizations, other people had a different worldview than their own. And so for students, that can be a really difficult concept.
If I can impart on them that sense, or that sense of, looking at the world from that point of view, or from a point of view like that, even if they don't agree with me, then they can take that approach and look at other things, maybe more modern things, and or maybe more things that are relevant to them or to the way they're understanding the world, and maybe think about things a new way, maybe become a more well-rounded person in some way or another, maybe become a more meaningful participant in a republic.
I usually frame the class, I think my big picture takeaway issue is globalization, and trying to get them to see how in the last 500 years the world has shrunk and it's continuing to shrink, and how the things that happen in the past as well as in places that are not necessarily nearby us geographically, that are not necessarily interesting to us in any particular way, have a huge effect on us, and how we're all increasingly interconnected. And so trying to get them to understand that a lot of the things that have happened in the past still affect us today. So I would actually say the biggest challenges come from the southern hemisphere. The biggest challenges, I guess, are one, the information is all unfamiliar to the students. And it takes a lot of explaining, and there's a lot of unfamiliar terms and unfamiliar names. And you can kind of see them, the eyes glaze over, and they just sort of blank out, and they're like, I'm never going to remember that name, so I'm not even going to try. That's one problem, is that it's just a lot of unfamiliar stuff. The other problem is in a class like that, where you're trying to hit really the big high points of globalization for the last 500 years, the Northern Hemisphere gets a preponderant amount of time, because that's where the concentration of global power has been.
Europe is not the center of the world. It's something that you kind of know, but it's really growing up, all you really think about is like, oh, there was Britain, France, and Spain, and they kind of fought a little bit. And China's somewhere in the world, and somewhere in there Russia becomes important slowly. I mean, India's a thing, but we don't really hear about it. In Japan, they're just kind of secluded off in their own little world with samurai or something. And that's what, that's kind of what I grew up hearing. So.
I would say that the Southern Hemisphere is what kind of gets left out. Latin America and Africa definitely get the short end of the straw.
We don't have time to attempt to cover everything, right? So we have to focus our attention. And so the question of what we should focus our attention on, how do we spend our scarce time and our scarce resources, is a very challenging question. And I'm guided by my reading in the historical discipline. So you have a sense of what people in the discipline think is important. And of course, the historical discipline is itself a creature of history, and so that has changed over time. back long ago, before really I got into the historical discipline, the important questions were, what did powerful people do? Rulers, presidents, these sorts of things. Questions of power, of war, of peace, of state making, and those were deemed to be important because they influenced the lives of many people in part. But of course, the historical discipline has changed over time. What's important has moved well beyond what powerful people do. And so
It's an interesting course. It's kind of funny because a few years ago when I was on the job market before I ended up here, I've had interviews with different institutions, some of which only offered world history and some offered Western civilizations. And there's a very tortured relationship with both of those courses that different states have. So it actually, depending on the state, students might have to take world history or not. And I remember interviewing at one small liberal arts college where they said, we tried world history and found it to be so broad as to be meaningless, so we got rid of it.
In fact, it was the chairman of the history department at the time, Steve Taylor, who engineered that transition to teaching world history rather than just simply Western civilization. I mean, the idea of moving to world history was to recognize that we're in a global environment, that the world is so deeply interconnected that to only have our American university students focus on the heritage of European and American civilization is really not enough. That, almost, it just, even though many Americans would rather think that they can still just be focused on our own country, in so many professions that students are going to be entering into, there is a global element to it. And if you do not have any knowledge of civilizations that are out there in the world and different, both different and similar to our own, to the heritage of the West, then you are going to be very handicapped and limited in what you can do. So I very much agree with the idea that in our changing world, we need to prepare our students to understand that world and to have an appreciation for the different cultural traditions and the interconnections which have developed over time, as well as the injustices and the biases and the dominance that has been exercised in the world. And we're still dealing with the consequences and aftermath of those injustices and biases and interferences which have happened. So
the British poet W.H. Auden described history in the following terms, said that history is, strictly speaking, the study of questions, and I think that's right.
Choosing which parts of world history to focus on as being the most important, that's a vast number of years and all kinds of different civilizations. So getting that across to students is a challenge.
I know more about the rest of the world. I've always, for the longest time, I've never really regarded the idea that the Aryan culture kind of ruled the world, but that's what more or less what schools taught us. And I knew that was never right, but I never really knew much about what else was happening. I never had the stones to throw at that idea. But yeah, there's a lot bigger world out there than just Europe.
Still, India and China are in a much more privileged position, historically speaking, than, say, people from sub-Saharan Africa or people from the Americas, indigenous people. So
I know a lot more about how, for a period, Asia pretty much ruled the world. China had a huge trade, kind of like monopoly on silk and porcelain and tea, and India was India was the reason we have the clothes we have today.
I don't feel like my students really appreciate the struggle as much as I do, even when I tell them about it. I think they're many of them come into the class already predisposed to not liking history, so fighting an uphill battle, and they're already predisposed to thinking that a history class should go in a particular way because they've gotten the same thing, they've been hit with the same thing over the head over and over again for 10 years or something. So if I can at least impart on them a sense of the struggle that is coming up with a cogent story of world history, then I feel like I've succeeded, even if it.
So I'm Dr. Nadia Williams, and I teach History 1111, so that's world civilizations to 1500 AD. We start with, I guess whatever you want to call it, Big Bang, origin of human civilizations, and go all the way to pretty much Columbus discovering America and kind of the shrinking world in 1500.
So I'm Jennifer Agus. I teach adjunct here at University of West Georgia.
I'm Tim Schroer. I teach history here at the University of West Georgia.
My name is Dr. Elaine McKinnon, and I am a professor here at the University of West Georgia in the history department. And for about 20 years now, I have been teaching every semester at least 2 sections of world history.
My name is Michael Epanchin. I teach World Civ 1 and 2 here.
I'm Dr. Molly McCullers, and I'm the Africanist specialist here in the history department. My work is primarily on 20th century Southern Africa, mainly looking at apartheid and decolonization in Namibia.
I'm Travis Wiley. I am a criminology and political science double major.